The interesting thing is we always read the Haggadah and we always ask, where is Moses? I think as we start this book of Exodus, sometimes the most important thing is what's said, and sometimes the most important thing is what is left unsaid. And this particular story is a wonderful introduction by contrast into the rest of the story of Exodus, which is about a people, not a person. Welcome to Madlik. My name is Jeffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on your favorite podcast platform and now on YouTube. This week's Torah portion is Parshat Shemot, and we begin the book of Exodus. The story of the miraculous birth, survival, and rise to power of Moses is striking in how closely it parallels other birth of a savior myths, both before and after the Hebrew Bible. But it's also striking how Moses' birth story, like his final resting place, is like an unmarked grave and leaves little to no mark on Jewish tradition or the subsequent story of the Exodus. To find out more, join us for the Nativity of Moses. So, Rabbi, we're starting another book, the book of Exodus, and I have looked at the story of the birth of Moses going into becoming a prince of Egypt from a different perspective, how it's kind of different than those typical myths where Odysseus is born to a royal family and then is exiled and comes home. We've always focused on the fact that here Moses came from a lowly family, went to a royal family, and came home. But today we're going to focus on the similarities, not on the differences. And very soon in our Parsha, in Exodus 2:2, it says, "The woman became pregnant and bore a son. She saw him and that he was goodly. So she hid him for 3 months." Now, I use Fox commentary because I was sure of all the commentaries, Fox would pick up on a cue here. The cue is in the Hebrew, it doesn't say that he was goodly. It says, ki tov hu. Ki tov, come on, that's from Genesis. That's right there. So even though Fox or any of the translations do not pick up on it,
it's definitely true.
The Talmud in Sota says, "And the rabbis say, at the time when Moses was born, the entire house was filled with light, as it is written here, and when she saw him that he was goodly, ki tov." And it is written there, "And God saw the light that it was good." So it literally quotes from Genesis. So I think we're going to see that the story of the birth of Moses, I call it the Nativity of Moses, but it truly fits into that category. There's danger, there's astrologers predicting, there's drama, there's light. This is truly the birth of the Savior, and we're going to look at the verses through that lens. So we start in Exodus 1, and it says, "A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, 'Look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them. Hava nitchachma lo.'" I did point out that lo means to him and not to them. We're going to get to that. Again, the commentaries pick up on this, not so much the translators. "So that they might not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they, or literally he, may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise up from the ground." So this is unfortunately a trope that has been leveled against the Jewish people for time immemorial. Maybe against any minority, but watch out. They're strangers amongst us. They will only multiply and they will conquer us. But as I said, we're going to look at it from the perspective of the birth of Moses. The Gemara in Sota, as quoted by the Ein Yaakov, talks about Pharaoh saying, "Let's deal wisely." It says, "Come on, let us deal wisely with him." It should have been with them, said Rab Chana ben Chanina. This means that he said to them, "Come, let us deal wisely with the Redeemer of Israel." So again, they pick up a cue from the text that I mentioned that, and I'd never focused on this before, Rabbi, that it truly was, let's watch out for him. So they had a little bit of a peg to stand on. I had not focused on that before.
Right, that's very good, actually, isn't it?
So it goes on, and Rab Chia bar Abba said in the name of Rab Yochanan, the following three, I would add, wise men were there: Bilam, Job, and Jethro.
This is a great medrash. I mean, whatever it means, it's amazing.
And it's famous. It's famous. Right. I didn't pull this out of some arcane book. If you study these texts, you know this tradition. They were advisors to Pharaoh concerning the decree to throw him into the water of the children of Israel. Bilam, who gave this advice, was killed. Job, who kept silent, was punished with chastisement. And Jethro, who ran away, was rewarded for having his descendants placed among the Sanhedrin in the chamber of the temple. So the first thing that I want to point out, because we are going to look at some stories similar to this that preceded it, but I think most of our listeners will already start, the bells will start ringing to the nativity scene of Jesus. And you had the three magi. So here we have the three kind of prophets. That's the one thing that's of interest. The second is they're all famous in our tradition, but they're all non-Jews. Anyone who studies Bilam, but especially Job, who people question, was it a real character, or was the whole book of Job just a allegory? This is the kind of
midrash. They make him real.
They make them real. And the thing about throwing them into the river, some of the commentaries really ascribe to these advisors a lot of Talmudic and biblical knowledge. They ascribe to them the knowledge of the flood of Noah. And they reason that since God promised Noah he would never destroy the world again with a flood, they said, well, we don't want to burn them. Let's throw them into the water because God will never be able to come back and drown us all.
Right.
Didn't work out so well, but again, it does tie in a little bit to the drowning in the Sea of Reeds that we come to later.
Now, I just want to say that none of the three gives really positive advice. Yitro is the best, and he runs away.
That's true. That's true. No one stood up to
no one stood
Pharaoh.
up. That's a very important point. Nobody stands up. We think of Yitro as a hero, but his reaction is not heroic.
Noted. We'll have to remember that when we do Parshat Yitro, right?
Sure.
So anyway, the story continues. The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives. It says le mialadot ha'ivriot, which could be the Hebrew midwives, and as we'll see, it could also be the midwives of the Hebrews.
The Hebrews, right? You can tell.
One of whom name was Shifra, and the other was Pua, saying, when you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. If it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, fearing God, did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live. It goes on with a whole nice back and forth about Pharaoh saying, why didn't you listen to me? And they go, well, these Jewish women, they don't need midwives. They can have children. They covered. But then in verse 22 it says, then Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every boy that is born you shall throw into the river, but let every girl live. So, Rabbi, this is escalating. Originally, it was just to throw the Jewish boys. He realizes he can't count on being so segmental, and so he says all of them. So
let's just take a second. To throw the Jewish boys in, it's kind of counterintuitive. Obviously, he thinks the Jewish boys become the soldiers, but it's the Jewish girls who have the children. So wouldn't he be better to throw the Jewish girls in to begin with? I know he changes his mind, but isn't that interesting that he starts with the boys rather than starting with the girls?
Absolutely, and we're going to see some of the commentaries attempt to answer it. Whether they answer it successfully or not, I leave that up to you and the listeners. But it's a good question, and again, it's an issue of segmental punishment, segmental weaning. I think the easiest answer that I would give you is that we live in a patrilineal society, and the nationhood was passed down through the father. If you kill out the father, you kill out the nation, the women will be assimilated into the host nation. I think that probably is the most easy answer, but I think it's a good question. I think more importantly is we see already segmenting. First, he tries to segment by gender, and then he tries to segment by a nation, and then he finally says, let's kill everybody. So Rashi says, L'chol ami, this may be translated, and Pharaoh gave command regarding all of his people. And he goes on to say, for on the day when Moses was born, his astrologers said to him, meaning to Pharaoh, today their deliverer has been born, but we know not whether he is born of an Egyptian father or an Israelite. But we see by our astrological art that he will ultimately suffer misfortune through water. So here we have these astrologists who are looking at the stars and saying that the Redeemer of Israel is being born. They didn't know if he was born to the Egyptians or to the Israelites. I think by branching it out a little bit, whether it's through the three wise men or here killing also the Egyptians, it also makes it a more universal story, doesn't it?
Right, no question about that.
So that becomes kind of interesting. Now, our good buddy Shadal addresses this question of were the midwives Jewish midwives? And so he says that while many of the commentaries say that they were Jewish midwives, he says that he believes that these midwives were of the Hebrews. And he brings a few proofs. He says, number one, it says that they feared God. You know, if they were of the same people, it would say that they loved the children or they felt united with them. The other thing that it says is it refers too many times to how when they talked about these Jews give birth in the following way. So what I think Shadal, but others have said, and this will be of interest to you, Rabbi, is that they could have been converts, or at least they felt an affinity with the Jewish people. Shifra and Pua, Shadal points out, are Hebrew Semitic names, not Egyptian names. He says maybe from the perspective of the Egyptians, they were Canaanites. They were just another Canaanite, but he thinks that they were not Jewish by birth. And I think again that makes the story that much more larger, enlarges the story and makes it bigger.
Good. I think that's now you understand before we get to a punchline, the idea of making the story bigger is important because this is the story of the birth of Moses. This is the beginning of the creation of the Jewish nation. The bigger you make the story, the better you make the story.
Absolutely. And I think one of the questions that I think any of us who reads Exodus has, whether we're Jewish or not, is how did this story get so big? Why are liberation movements still quoting it? Why did African Americans tag on to the story of the Israelite slaves being freed? Why did it clearly affect the whole Christian story of Jesus going through the Passover sacrifice and all that? This is a major story, and this, in a way, kind of following up on what you just said, if he's the Redeemer of the Israelites, in a sense, he's the Redeemer of the world, because this was the story that showed that history can go somewhere, that people can be free, can become their own people. So yes, it would be very natural to aggrandize and make this story bigger. You kind of referenced before how the traditional commentaries actually see Pharaoh going through three stages here. The first is, if it be a son, you shall kill him, meaning an Israelite son. Then afterwards, the Talmud seems to think that every child that is born, and then it says even if it was an Egyptian, it's clearly trying to make this into a large story of the Egyptian. In the Midrash Tanhuma, it tries to fill in the blanks of what did Pharaoh say to his people? How was he able to orchestrate this killing of all boys that were born? So he says, why were they commanded to do this? Because the astrologers had told him the Redeemer of Israel will be born on that day, but we do not know whether he'll be an Egyptian or an Israelite. At that time, Pharaoh assembled every Egyptian and said to them, loan me your sons for a day, as it said, and every son that is born ye shall cast. It does not say every child of an Israelite, but every son. So here we have also, I've always talked, and we've talked about the subterfuge that the people of Israel did to get out of Egypt. Clearly, Pharaoh, at least through the lens of our commentaries, was also using subterfuge. He didn't just come out and say, kill the Jews. He created this working through the
astrologers.
The astrologers, and then working through the midwives, then working through his people, loan me your child.
Astrologers, it shows that Pharaoh was worried about something. You only go to the astrologers if you say, I woke up this morning and I was suspicious about something. So he went to his astrologers. Something gave Pharaoh a bad feeling.
Well, absolutely. Now, one of the puzzles that we need to solve, and I said this in the intro, was that this story did not really resonate later on. You almost have it put it between parentheses. When Moses came and saw Pharaoh, you don't even have Pharaoh relating to the story of Moses killing the taskmaster and exiling himself. You certainly don't have a sense of Pharaoh ever saying to him, my God, you were a prince of Egypt. You grew up in my house. It's really kind of isolated, this story. The Ramban says it appears that this decree to drown the Israelite children lasted for a short time. And he brings, of course, the fact that Aaron was born 3 years before. Doesn't seem like anything else like this happened. So again, it gets back to this whole kind of narrative that we've been following, where this is about Moses. It's not about the people. It's about the astrologers who said somebody's going to be born. It's this week, this month, this 9-month cycle. We've got to address it. But that also kind of jives with what modern scholars say in terms of this story kind of sits by itself. But I will argue that you don't have to be a higher critical fan to see that this story kind of stands on its own and didn't really resonate later on in this story or elsewhere. One of these commentaries is a guy named Jonathan Cohen, who wrote a book, The Origins and Evolution of the Moses Nativity Story. And he says the murder and annihilation motif disappear completely after Exodus 2:10, after it has served its purpose of introducing the birth of the Savior. The motive also detracts from the crescendo in the theme of increasing enslavement, and he uses Ramban as an example of a classical commentary who also kind of supplements that and confirms it was a one-off, clearly focused on Moses. But again, it does give us a little bit of a license, Rabbi, to look at this as a nativity story. It really related to the birth of Moses, and then the rest of the story is the exodus of the Jewish people.
Good. I mean, and we're combining the two stories, because obviously the whole purpose of the Parsha of Shemot is to combine the nativity story with the Exodus story, and that's interesting. And those stories come together at the burning bush, because they have to come together at a holy moment.
That's the segue. Right. That's the segue. So you had questioned why they only killed the boys and not the girl. Cassuto gives the following, and it is a segue itself. He says, similar to the fear that Avram had when he went down to Egypt with his wife Sarai, and he says, they will kill me, and you, Sarah, they will let live. What Cassuto is saying, and this does kind of jive with what some of the classical commentaries said, is they wanted to kill the men and then have the women as sexual objects, take them as wives or mistresses. So Kasuto is tying this back to the Abraham story in the sense that this is what the Egyptians did.
That's a Dvar Torah, because that's not there. So he says, you see from elsewhere that killing the men is a way of getting to the women. Okay, it's a nice Dvar Torah. I'm not sure it's really what the story means, but okay.
I think the real answer is a patrilineal society,
Right?
Or the war thing that you brought up before. Let's kill the fighters, but. Kasuto does serve as an interesting segue to the fact that our Midrashim have a very similar story about Abraham, the quote-unquote nativity of Abraham, as they do about Moses. Because according to many of the commentaries, and I put some links in the source notes to Legends of the Jews by Ginsburg, and he really flushes this out. But ultimately what they say in this midrash is that before Abraham was born, their astrologers looked up in the sky and they saw a very large star rising. And they said to themselves, what happens if we don't share this with Nimrod? We could get in trouble. And so they come to Nimrod and they said, we have been informed that a son hath been born unto Terach, thy chief commander, and we went unto his house last night. And what they are saying is the king should give unto Terach the value of that child, and we will slay him ere he grows up and increases in the land to bring about this great evil. So Rabbi, Midrashim create a parallel of Abraham, who clearly could also be considered the founder of the Israelite tradition, and they have a similar story with astrologers, with wise men consulting with the king and telling him to kill this child. It does become fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, right. I mean, that's part of you call the nativity scene, making it more of a story, including a bigger theme, is also part of the idea of making it more significant. Right? It's almost like we're going to get to the story of Mount Sinai. And there's a medrash about Mount Sinai that the whole world was quiet when God gave the Ten Commandments. Like, why is that necessary? Of course it's necessary. Because if revelation is something that's earth-shattering, the whole world needs to be quiet. So here, too, you have something like that. They make the story bigger in order to make it more significant.
I think that's obviously true. I also think that not only bigger, but they have to add this drama of danger and supply and demand type of thing, where this is very rare, this is very tenuous. And of course, I made an allusion before to other stories similar to this. But even before we go there, those of our listeners who know the New Testament know that in Matthew there is this prequel to the birth of Jesus, where again it says that Herod heard that the Redeemer of the Jews was going to be born in Bethlehem, and he made a decree to kill all of the boys born in Bethlehem. Clearly, this story and these midrashim were well known enough that they were worth repurposing, so to speak, for any future narrative of the birth of a Redeemer. And I think that's the real takeaway. And of course, the other takeaway, Rabbi, is when you and I are in Europe and we see the painting of the massacre of the innocent, we now know what we're looking at.
What it is, what that's all about.
So let's go now to the second part of the story. We've had the birth part with the drama of the birthing mothers and throwing into the Nile. Then in Exodus 2:1, it says, a certain member of the house of Levi went and took into his household as his wife a woman of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw how beautiful he was, I referenced this before, she hid him for 3 months. When he could hide him no longer, she got a wicker basket for him. And the word for a wicker basket is a tevat, which sounds a little bit like tevat Noach. And corked it with bitimon and pitch, put the child placed it into the reeds of the bank of the Nile, and his sister stationed herself at a distance to learn what would befall him. We had that a little bit with Hagar. It's an important moment. We certainly had it with Joseph's story, where the brothers threw him into the pit, and they said, let's see what's going to happen with all of his prophecies. And then we know what happened next, where Pharaoh's daughter took him, and she got a nursing mother who turned out to be his natural mother. So Miriam and Yocheved are involved. And then in verse 10, it says, when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who made her son, which is kind of interesting. She actually raised him at home and then brought him to the palace.
And she named him, or we had a grandson today. The name is important. And the people who name are the parents. The grandparents have no say in the name, right? It's the parents who name. So if the daughter of Pharaoh names the child, that's significant. She's in place of the mother.
Yep. Absolutely. So you're saying she named him Moses. This is Bat Pharaoh. We had a little bit of adoption last week where Joseph adopted Manasseh and Ephraim. Here, what you're arguing is that Pharaoh's daughter, by naming him, he was a true child, prince of Egypt. Sometime after that, when Moses had grown up, this is a real quick segue. He went out to his kinsfolk and witnessed their labors. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen. He turned this way and that, and seeing no one about, he struck down the Egyptian, hit him in the sand. When he went out the next day, he found two Hebrews fighting. So he said to the offender, why do you strike your fellow? He retorted, who made you chief and ruler over us? Do you mean to kill me the same way that you killed the Egyptian? Moses was frightened and thought, then the matter is known. When Pharaoh learnt of the matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh. He arrived in the land of Midian and sat down beside a well.
Which is the beginning of the burning bush story.
And of course, now we have twice that Pharaoh is wanting to kill Moses. And again, you could make the case that this is the father trying to kill his son, certainly an adopted father trying to kill his son. It is the second time that, in a sense, Moses is fleeing. The first time they hid him, and here they put him into the water. What's interesting is the Talmud in Sota says, a sage teaches Amram, the father of Moses, was the great man of his generation. He saw that the wicked Pharaoh said, every son that is born shall be cast into the river. And he said, we are laboring for nothing. Leshav anu amalin. He arose and divorced his wife. And then it's a beautiful story, and we could do a whole other podcast on the critical role of women moving this story forward.
Especially Miriam.
Especially
Miriam is kind of a forgotten character. She pops up a few times. But here it's the best story of all about Miriam.
So Miriam confronts her father and says, if you are a leader of the generation, if you separate from your wife, all the men will separate from their wives, and you're going to destroy our people for good. So at that, Amram accepted his daughter's words and arose and brought back, meaning he remarried his wife, and all others saw this, followed his example, brought back their wives. And so the Gemara asks, if Amram remarried Yocheved, it should have said, in return for a wife.
Right, would have said he married her again.
There's a little bit of the question of who was the father, so to speak, because he was officially married, then he kind of came back. And so the rabbis are kind of reading a little bit of intrigue into this, which
because
again...
Aaron and Miriam danced before her. So there's no Moses. This whole story happens before Moses is born. It's very odd, right? Your point is a good point. The timing is odd.
So the timing is odd. And again, they're not pulling this from nowhere. The way the story starts in the Bible itself is a certain member of the house of Levi went and took
right, you
unto
don't know who it is. Right.
It's innocuous.
Amram's name is never mentioned.
Correct. And that too is part and parcel of these stories where you don't have to be a Freudian who gets into the intrigue of father-son relationships. The idea is that this Savior is born. He has to travel out into foreign lands. He has to prove himself. There are those that want to kill him, maybe his father. And by killing that slave master, in a sense, he was killing an Egyptian, maybe an analog for his father. It really does have all of the ingredients of a typical nativity scene. And I think, similar to Sargon, if you look into the source sheet, you will see additional information about Sargon, Cyrus, Romulus. But I think, Rabbi, as we finish up, the interesting thing is, we always read the Haggadah, and we always ask, where is Moses? And you love to say there's Pshat and there's Midrash, so we all have beautiful Midrashim. But I think we can kind of agree with the higher biblical critics who say that this story is isolated and that doesn't really have that much purchase going forward in the story of the Exodus, that there was a very strong and deep bias against hero worship. On the one hand, the story is there with all its ingredients, and on the other hand, within our own tradition, it remained in the background. It remained more, I would say, the way you like to say it is, it's a midrash. It's a nice story, but it didn't really affect our people. And I think as we start this book of Exodus, sometimes the most important thing is what's said, and sometimes the most important thing is what is left unsaid. And this particular story is there because maybe it has to be, but I think it really is a wonderful introduction by contrast into the rest of the story of Exodus, which is about a people, not a person.
I think that's great. I mean, we didn't even talk about this idea of growing up in Pharaoh's house and why that's part of the story, right? Why the leader needs to be exposed to Pharaoh's house, even though Pharaoh becomes the enemy. That we can leave that for next year's podcast. But I think that's part of this story about what the nativity scene, what the birth of Moses, what that's all about. This is great.
So anyway, today was the Brit of your grandson. Mazel tov to you. And we look forward to reading the next Parsha in Exodus next week and diving into this amazing story that has had such a great impact on culture, religion, and ideology. Shabbat
Amazing.
shalom.
Looking forward. Shabbat shalom.